class in that city after Beijing. So certainly the middle class is alive and well in the newly prosperous and developing Chengdu. Stevens is also went to Chongqing on his first visit, and that has a population of about 30 million people. Not all in the rural area, it's a very substantial rural belt just around the rural area, around the urban area, but it is a very big city with about 12 million people living in the city proper. Because of the spread of development across China, I made my point to visit every single province in China, all 31 of them officially, and that's another record to my tenure. I'm the first Australian ambassador to officially attend all China's 31 provinces. But this is the new age in China. We really do need to move beyond the eastern seaboard. And remember, on the eastern seaboard, some of the capital incomes now are very, very high, also in cities that many people may never have heard about. For example, Dali, Qingdao, Ningbo, Hangzhou, these cities that all have capital incomes way over 10,000, 12,000 US dollars. So, turning to the marketing dimensions of this and how we position ourselves, I'll share a few thoughts with you, but I must say that I'm not an expert on marketing strategies, and therefore my views on Chinese potential tourists must necessarily derive from discussions with Chinese friends, chance encounters, usually with attractive young women on flights, and other bits of anecdotal evidence. But I do live amongst a lot of Chinese people, and I am intrigued by what influences their choices for tourism. So there's no science in this, but I'll share with you some personal observations. Whilst Australia has been successful, if you look at the raw numbers in marketing tourism to China, I think it's very important to be clear, and I was delighted with the earlier presentations, that it's important to focus on the high end of the market. I draw the analogy with the Australian wine industry, which has been remarkably successful in recent years, to a surprising extent, I believe, because it started to concentrate on the high end of the market. And just as an aside on wine, we have the second largest share of the Chinese market in terms of bottled wine. France has 30% of the market, we have 22% of the market, and below that, all the other competitors with us, including European competitors, have just about 7% of the market. That gives you an indication, I think, of what a well-targeted, high-end strategy can deliver in China. And of course, if you get the top end right, I'm sure marketing people will tell you that will pull through the bulk end of the market. I think the target cohort for China is in the 25-45 year age group. They're relatively affluent, and I describe them as being cashed up, seeking comfort. Because China, as I said, is still an unsophisticated market, notwithstanding that there are many, most of these people are internationally oriented and are aware of the world outside. But for this group, the top travel destinations would most likely be Paris, Milan, Rome, and London. Naturally, the order might move around, but the interest in these places is not as it would be for us, the history, art, culture, or even the food. But I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to say. It is first and foremost famous designer brands. Nowhere else can Chinese tourists have the confidence and certainty, indeed the comfort, and the prestige amongst their friends of shopping in these citadels of brand names. So hence they do top the lists. And also they know that they can get the latest and certainly genuine goods, and of course in most countries get that refund on the way out. Next would be, I think, the famous cities of the US, New York especially, Los Angeles, and of course Las Vegas. The US has a strange and powerful pull on Chinese thinking. Chinese people greatly admire and envy the success of the US without really understanding the reasons for it. At the same time, they deeply mistrust US intentions towards China, something that, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is always happy to do its best to foster. But for the Chinese, the US is still number one, and it is a must-see destination. Then there's a group of countries at the next level, which would include Australia. It's here that we have a strong attraction. We're Western and developed. We draw a lot of Chinese students, and parents feel we're a safe destination. We're further away in Southeast Asia, which makes us interesting, but not as distant as Canada or Latin America, and of course the time zone is an element, particularly for short-term travellers. And the food is far less challenging for a Chinese person than, say, in a country like India. So Australia should be well placed to attract more and more of these types of tourists. But as I mentioned, I think it's a challenge for us to strike the right marketing note. And partly that comes from the diversity of Australia itself. Something we think of as a strength, but it's hard to bundle up a consistent message with such diversity. One thing Chinese visitors, especially women, do not want to do is to lie on a beach turning bronze. Chinese women spend a great deal of their time hiding themselves from the sun and whitening their skin. Similarly, water sports, by and large, are not a big hit. Most Chinese are frightened of the sea, many can't swim at all, and most of those who can are very weak swimmers by comparisons with Australians. You only have to spend some time in a lapping pool in China to prove that point. And I meant to meet someone in China who wants to be chased by a crocodile or bitten by a snake. Australia's natural bush, flora and fauna, which we market aggressively, is frankly of little attraction to Chinese visitors at this stage of their tourist development. I'm sure it will come in time and tourists become more sophisticated by becoming more exposed to different parts of the world and as Chinese tourism matures. But these are still early days. And should I say, and again from a personal experience, Chinese individual tourists who we wish to market really don't like to be targeted at immigration in Australia through profiling and be pulled out of the queue and questioned. What then do Chinese tourists want? In addition to comfort, they are looking for a brand from Australia with which to identify. It's the buzz among their friends, among the peer group. It gives them status. And the status must derive from them having been to Australia. It's for a simple way of understanding and explaining why one would go to Australia. There's no need for them to explain, for example, why they've gone to Paris or Milan. It's simple, it's a single word, shopping. I can't imagine, though, how the phrase, there's nothing like Australia, could well become part of such a conversation amongst the Chinese targeted tourists that we have in mind. I think this is a way of getting Chinese people to talk about Australia. Of course, we do have all the necessary elements that will attract Chinese. In no particular order, but we're known for our clean air, the slower pace of life, our clean green image. And don't forget, these things are going to be extremely important, especially because we have them in an urban context. And it's my feeling that much of these visitors are essentially at this stage urban visitors. And don't forget, these people live in a madhouse, be it a first or second or fourth tier city, of high levels of pollution, enormous work pressure, enormous congestion on the roads. So the idea that you can come to a city where you have the sophistication and modern amenities that Australia has, but which is at a slower pace, where you know the air's clean, the food's safe, these are very powerful attractions. So for many tourists, it's the built icons of Australia, and most of them here, the Sydney Opera House, or quaint European-style architecture of Melbourne, or high-end hotels near the beach at the Gold Coast, but of course without having to be exposed to the depredations of actually being on the beach itself. Other than, of course, the mandatory photo opportunity on Bondi Beach. China's middle class, as we saw a couple of decades ago in Japan, are identifying strongly with wine culture. This is a very standard middle class thing, I think, in Asia as incomes rise. And they're very much interested in the food and vineyard tourism. And the number of high-end lifestyle magazines that concentrate on this is really quite remarkable. So it needs to be high-end. Our restaurants are very interested in Chinese, especially when they are serving our famous seafood, but serving it primarily in the Chinese style. And although the famous international brand name stores of Castlereagh Street are not quite Tivoli or Georgetown, they are still an attraction, especially when on departure you can have a 10% GST rebate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Geoff. We turn the lights up. We do have some time for questions now. I'm wondering whether or not we should send Laurie Lawrence up to China. Andrew, just try and get to make swimmers out of them. Certainly they can compete at the trouble when it comes to the Olympics, but nevertheless. I'll just mind the working questions if I can. You talk about an unsophisticated tourist. But you also talk about the growth of the middle class and the development of the upper end of the market is obviously very appealing to Australia. Do you imagine that unsophistication will persist, the interest in shopping and so forth? Or do you think that market will develop with possibilities for Australia?
Yeah, well, just to be clear on unsophisticated, it is at the high end. I think we see high-end tourists as necessarily sophisticated because we project our own attitudes onto them. I think that's got a long way to run. Of course, China gets very, very diverse, and you will have people that travel to Europe who are experts on European art and culture. But if we're looking at big numbers coming out of the middle class, then they have money, they're cashed up, but they're years behind travelling for the sorts of travelling for reasons that require a lot of education and knowledge and thinking about the place where you're going. I do think over time, and I don't have any good reasons from a Chinese perspective, but you've seen it with Japan and other Asian tourists to Australia, after having been exposed and come over time, interest has increased in adventure travel, going to the outback, more interest in knowledge about Australian Indigenous culture, flora and fauna, but China's a long way from that point.
We have a question at the front of the room, and one
Yes, excuse me, good morning. Girl Parsonage from International Institute of Peace and Tourism. I think you just answered my question, actually. I was piggybacking on the conference in Perth with the Australian Indigenous Tourism Conference and my 30 years experience of going backwards and forwards to China. Do you believe that the potential Chinese tourists can be interested in the Indigenous tourism products that we have that haven't actually been mentioned so far this morning in any detail?
Thank you. If you recall last year, China's Vice President Xi Jinping was in Australia in June last year, and he personally requested to go to Kakadu and Northern Territory and Kakadu, and he particularly wanted to see Australian Indigenous rock art and to learn about Australian Indigenous culture. And I think that's very interesting. He has also, unusually for any world leader, he's likely to be the next president of China. It's unusual for any world leader to visit every state and territory in Australia except for one. He's been to them all except for one, and he's very keen to get to Tasmania as soon as he can. But the point is, he has a high level of interest. But this is where you can see tourism developing, and there will always be a small group interested. When we launched the Year of Australian Culture in China last year, we began with a major Indigenous art exhibition at the National Museum of Art in Beijing. It was a wonderful exhibition, and on the Chinese side, they themselves had explicitly requested that would be the opening exhibition. But when we made suggestions, or our curators made suggestions about what it should feature, they didn't want something that was contemporary or where we were today. They wanted a didactic exhibition so they could explain to visitors who are interested in this the evolution of Indigenous art in Australia. So that is, I think, where we are. We're still at a very early stage in the knowledge and understanding. A couple of, on the commercial side, a couple of